The meeting room was bigger than anything humans had ever built. It stretched across space itself, held together by technology that bent gravity and light. Inside this impossible space, representatives from 14,000 different alien species gathered to talk about the same problem they had been discussing for over 700 years. Jiwan sat in the back corner of the observation deck, her feet resting on the railing in front of her. She was drinking her third cup of coffee that morning and scrolling through documents on her tablet. The aliens were arguing again, their voices translating through thousands of devices into every known language in the galaxy. She had been Earth's diplomatic attaché for 2 years now. It was a boring job most of the time. Humans were new to galactic politics. Most alien species treated them like children who had just learned to walk. They smiled politely at human representatives and then ignored everything they said. Jiwan did not really mind. The station had good coffee, the pay was excellent, and she got to read interesting things while the aliens talked in circles about problems they could not solve. Today's problem was called the threshold problem, though some species called it the barrier question or the wall of reality. Jiwan had read about it during her first week on the station. It was actually interesting. Unlike most of the things the council debated, Ambassador Krell stood at the center of the chamber. He was from a species called the Vanthi, and his body looked like living crystal that caught and reflected light in strange ways. He had 6 arms, and right now he was waving all of them in frustration. "We have run 17 billion computer simulations," his translator announced. "Every single simulation shows the same result. We cannot cross the barrier. The energy needed would be more than 10,000 stars produce in their entire lifetimes. It is impossible." The representative from Hive Nexus 7 clicked her mandibles together. She looked like a giant insect, though Jiwan knew that was an oversimplification. "Our computers agree with the Vanthi calculations. The mathematics are clear. The barrier cannot be crossed without destroying everything around it." High Chancellor Vex dimmed the glowing patches on his body. His species had invented faster-than-light travel when humans were still living in caves. If he said something was impossible, most species listened. "Perhaps we must accept the truth," Vex said. His voice was old and tired. "Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed. Even the ancients could not solve this problem, and they were far more advanced than we are." Jiwan took another sip of coffee and continued reading. The barrier was not a physical wall. It was a mathematical limit built into the fabric of reality itself. Beyond a certain point in space, the laws of physics changed in ways that made travel impossible. Not difficult, impossible. Beyond the barrier lay entire sections of the galaxy that no one could reach. Planets, stars, maybe even other civilizations, all locked away forever behind an invisible wall made of mathematics and physics. Every great civilization in galactic history had tried to solve the barrier problem. The Vanthi had spent 3,000 years on it. The Hive had built computers the size of moons to calculate solutions. The Centaurians had sent their best scientists to study it for generations. All of them had failed. The Council had been officially working on the problem for 743 years. They had formed committees and research groups. They had funded studies that cost more than entire planetary economies. They had published millions of papers and held thousands of conferences, and they were no closer to a solution than when they started. Jiwan found this fascinating. Not because the problem was interesting, though it was, but because everyone kept trying the same approaches over and over, expecting different results. She had been reading the Council's research archives for months now. It was something to do during the long, boring sessions where aliens argued about trade regulations and cultural exchange programs. The threshold problem kept appearing in her reading, and something about it bothered her. All the research followed the same basic pattern. Calculate the energy needed to break through the barrier. Realize it was impossible. Try to find ways to generate more energy. Fail. Repeat. 700 years of really smart aliens doing the same thing and getting the same result. On the main floor, Ambassador Krell was proposing another study. This one would take a century and involve the construction of new supercomputers. It would cost more than Earth's entire economy. "We must try again," Krell said. "Perhaps with better computers and more refined calculations we will find an answer." Jiwan almost laughed. She covered it by taking another drink of coffee. Envoy Thrace, a Centaurian sitting near her in the observation deck, heard the sound. "Did you say something, Attaché Kim?" Thrace always spoke to her like she was a child. His species had been in the Council for 3,000 years. Humans had been members for 15 years. To Thrace, she might as well be a baby. Just thinking out loud, Jiwan said. This new study they are proposing. It is using the same mathematics as all the previous studies, right? Thrace's facial tentacles curled, and what Jiwan had learned was amusement. Of course. The Krell-Vex equations are the foundation of all dimensional barrier mathematics. They have been proven correct by thousands of years of research. But they keep giving the same wrong answer. The amusement left Thrace's face. I would not expect a human to understand the complexities involved. These equations represent the combined knowledge of the greatest minds in galactic history. Jiwan nodded and went back to her tablet. There was no point in arguing. Thrace had made up his mind about humans long before meeting her, but she kept thinking about the problem. Everyone was so focused on breaking through the barrier, smashing through it with enough energy to overcome its resistance, like trying to knock down a wall by hitting it harder and harder. What if that was the wrong approach entirely? Down on the main floor, the council was voting on whether to fund the new study. Jiwan already knew they would approve it. They always approved these studies. It made them feel like they were doing something, even if that something never worked. She finished her coffee and stood up. The observation deck was mostly empty. Junior species like humanity did not get much of a voice in council debates. They were here to watch and learn, not to participate. Jiwan walked to the viewing window and looked out at the stars. Half of those stars were beyond the barrier, unreachable, locked away by mathematics that said they could not be reached. But mathematics was not magic. It was just a way of describing reality. And if your mathematics kept giving you impossible answers, maybe you were describing reality wrong. She pulled up the threshold problem files on her tablet again. 700 years of research, thousands of brilliant scientists, millions of calculations, all based on the same core assumptions. Jiwan smiled. She had an idea. It was probably stupid. The aliens would certainly think it was stupid. But it was at least a different kind of stupid than what they had been trying for 7 centuries. She headed back to her office. Hyunwoo would probably call her crazy. He usually did when she had these kinds of ideas. But he would help her anyway. That was what assistants were for, and she was going to need a lot more coffee. Jiwan walked through the station corridors holding her 4th cup of coffee. The human embassy was located in the outer ring, far from the important offices where senior species conducted their business. It was a small space, but it had windows that looked out at the stars, and that was enough. Hyunwoo was sitting at his desk when she entered, reviewing trade reports. He looked up when the door opened and immediately recognized the expression on her face. "Oh no," he said. "You have an idea." "I have an idea," Jiwan confirmed, sitting down at her own desk. "Is it going to get us in trouble?" "Probably not. The worst that can happen is everyone thinks I'm stupid." "So, a normal day then," Hyunwoo said with a smile. He closed his reports and turned his chair to face her. "What is it this time?" Jiwan pulled up the threshold problem files on the large display screen in their office. Equations filled the screen, complex mathematics that described the fundamental structure of reality. The barrier problem. The council has been working on it for 700 years. Hyunwoo nodded. "I know. I have been reading about it too. They just approved another century-long study. Another 1 trillion credits spent on computers that will tell them what they already know, that it is impossible to cross." "Right. Because the energy requirements are ridiculous. You would need to destroy thousands of stars just to punch through." Jiwan took a sip of coffee and stared at the equations. What if they are asking the wrong question? "What do you mean?" "Everyone is trying to figure out how to break through the barrier, how to generate enough energy to smash through it like breaking down a wall. But what if you do not need to break through it at all?" Hyunwoo leaned back in his chair. "The barrier exists across all normal space. There is no way around it. The smartest species in the galaxy have confirmed this thousands of times. In normal space, yes. But what about abnormal space? That is not a thing." "Sure it is. How do ships travel faster than light?" Hyunwoo frowned. "They fold space using quantum effects. The Vanthi discovered it about 10,000 years ago." "Exactly. They do not travel through normal space. They manipulate reality at the quantum level to create shortcuts. They treat space as flexible rather than fixed." "Okay, but what does that have to do with the barrier?" Jiwan pulled up another set of files, these ones showing the fundamental equations that describe the barrier itself. The barrier exists because of something called dimensional rigidity. At certain energy thresholds, space becomes rigid and cannot be crossed or manipulated. It is like concrete hardening. I am following so far. All of the Council's research treats this rigidity as a fixed property, something that exists whether anyone is looking at it or not. They measure how rigid it is, calculate how much energy would be needed to overcome that rigidity, and conclude that it is impossible. Because it is impossible. But what if the rigidity is not a fixed property? What if it only exists because they are measuring it? Hyunwoo blinked. You lost me. Jiwon stood up and started pacing. She always thought better when she moved. In quantum mechanics, observation affects the system being observed. If you measure a particle's position, you change its momentum. If you measure its momentum, you change its position. The act of observation changes reality. That is basic quantum physics. Everyone knows that. Right. But the Council's equations for the barrier do not account for observer effects. They treat the barrier as a classical object, something that exists independent of observation. But what if it does not? What if the barrier only has the properties it has because that is what everyone expects to find? Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment, thinking. You are saying the barrier exists because everyone believes it exists? Not exactly. I am saying the barrier's properties are partially determined by how we observe it. If you approach it with instruments designed to measure dimensional rigidity, you will find dimensional rigidity, because that is what you are looking for. But if you approach it with instruments designed to measure something else, then maybe you find something else. Hyunwoo stood up and walked to the display screen, studying the equations. This is crazy. You are talking about rewriting the fundamental equations that describe reality. No, I am talking about adding one variable that everyone forgot to include: observer dependency at the quantum dimensional level. The Council will never accept this. You are basically saying their 700 years of research is based on a flawed assumption. Not flawed. Incomplete. Hyunwoo laughed, but it was not a happy sound. Jiwon, these are species that have been studying physics for thousands of years longer than humans have existed. The Vanthi were building starships when our ancestors were figuring out fire. You really think you spotted something they all missed? Yes. Why? And what makes you so sure? Jiwon sat back down and finished her coffee. Because they have too much invested in being right. 700 years of research, thousands of scientists, millions of papers published, all of it based on the Krelvex equations. If those equations are missing something fundamental, it means all of that work was incomplete. So they would rather keep failing than admit they might be wrong. Not consciously. But yes, and I am new. I have no reputation to protect. No published papers that would be invalidated, no career built on these equations being correct. I can ask stupid questions without losing anything. Hyunwoo sat down heavily. Okay, let us say you are right. Let us say the barrier is observer dependent. How do you prove it? Mathematics first. I need to modify the Krelvex equations to include observer dependency variables. If the math works out, then we can talk about building instruments to test it. That will take months, maybe years. 3 weeks, Jiwon said. I can do the basic framework in 3 weeks. Then we can run simulations to see if it works. 3 weeks? Jiwon, the Council's top scientists have been working on this for centuries. And they have been trying to solve the wrong problem for centuries. I am trying to solve a different problem. That should be faster. Hyunwoo smiled despite himself. You are either brilliant or completely insane. Maybe both, Jiwon said. Will you help me? Hyunwoo sighed. Of course I will help you. Someone needs to be here to document the moment when the entire Council laughs at us. That is the spirit. They worked through the night. Jiwon pulled up every file she could find on the barrier, on the Krelvex equations, on quantum observer effects, on dimensional physics. Hyunwoo helped her organize the information and check her mathematics. The sun was rising outside their window when Jiwon finally leaned back from her screen. I think I have something, she said. Hyunwoo looked at her display. Equations covered the screen, variations on the standard Krelvex formulas but with additional terms that accounted for quantum observer effects at the dimensional level. Does it work? He asked. On paper, yes. The math is consistent. It does not violate any physical laws. And if I am right, it suggests that the barrier is not nearly as rigid as everyone thinks. How not rigid? Jiwon pulled up a simulation. If we approach the barrier with the right instruments calibrated to measure dimensional flexibility instead of rigidity, the barrier should basically disappear. Disappear? Not literally, but it would stop acting like an impenetrable wall. It would behave more like water. Still there, but something you can move through. Hyunwoo stared at the simulation. This is going to change everything. If it works. If it works, Hyunwoo agreed. What do we do now? Jiwon stood up and stretched. Her back hurt from sitting all night. She needed more coffee. Now we test it. Run proper simulations, check the math 1,000 times, make sure I did not make some stupid mistake. And then we ask the council for permission to present our findings. They will never give us permission. We are humans, junior species. Why would they listen to us? Jiwon smiled. Because if I am right, this solves a problem they have been working on since before humans invented writing. Even if they think I am probably wrong, they will be curious enough to let me try. She was right about that. 3 weeks later, after countless simulations and mathematical reviews, Jiwon submitted a formal request to present to the full council. The request was approved. The day of the presentation arrived faster than Jiwon expected. She stood outside the main council chamber, wearing her best diplomatic uniform and holding a data pad with her research. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she told herself it was just the coffee. Hyunwoo stood beside her looking nervous. You do not have to do this. We could withdraw the request. Say we made a mistake. I am not withdrawing. They are going to think you are crazy. Probably. Your career could be over. Then I will go back to Earth and get a normal job. Hyunwoo smiled. You would hate a normal job. I really would. The chamber doors opened. A Vanthi official gestured for them to enter. Jiwon took a deep breath and walked inside. The Grand Council chamber was even more impressive from the floor than from the observation deck. 14,000 species surrounded her, arranged in impossible geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Some representatives were physical beings like herself. Others existed as energy patterns or quantum probability clouds or stranger things that did not translate well to human perception. High Chancellor Vex sat at the center of everything, his bioluminescent patches glowing softly. Attaché Kim, you have requested time to present findings related to the threshold problem. The Council has agreed to hear you, though I must say we are curious. You are very young, both as an individual and as a species. What could you possibly know about a problem that has defeated our greatest minds for centuries? Jiwon walked to the center platform. Her voice was amplified across the chamber, translated instantly into thousands of languages. Thank you, Chancellor. I understand your skepticism. Humans are new to galactic society. We have not been studying the barrier for very long, but sometimes a fresh perspective can see things that experts miss. Ambassador Krell's crystal body reflected light around the chamber. We have heard many claims like this before. Every few decades, someone believes they have solved the barrier problem. All of them have been wrong. I understand. That is why I am not claiming to have solved it. I am claiming that everyone has been trying to solve the wrong problem. That caused a stir. Thousands of voices murmured across multiple frequencies. Explain, Vex said. Jiwon pulled up her first display. It showed the standard Krell-Vex equations that had been the foundation of barrier research for centuries. These equations describe the barrier as a fixed property of spacetime, dimensional rigidity that exists independent of observation. And based on these equations, crossing the barrier is impossible. The energy requirements are absurd. This is correct mathematics based on the assumptions built into the equations. Those assumptions have been verified millions of times, Krell said. Have they? Or have they just been repeated millions of times? The chamber went quiet. Jiwon continued. The Krell-Vex equations treat the barrier as a classical object, something that exists objectively, regardless of whether anyone is observing it. But we know from quantum mechanics that observation affects reality. The act of measurement changes the system being measured. Envoy Thrace spoke from somewhere in the crowd. We are aware of quantum observer effects. They apply to subatomic particles, not to large-scale dimensional structures. Why not? Jiwon asked. Why should quantum effects disappear at larger scales, especially at dimensional boundaries where the normal rules of physics are already breaking down? She pulled up her modified equations. I have taken the Krell-Vex equations and added terms that account for quantum observer dependency at the dimensional level. The mathematics remain consistent. I have not violated any physical laws. I have just included a variable that was previously ignored. The equations appeared on holographic displays around the chamber. Thousands of alien scientists began reviewing them immediately. These are interesting, Vex said slowly. But what do they suggest? They suggest that the barrier's properties are partially determined by how we observe it. When we send probes with instruments calibrated to measure dimensional rigidity, we find dimensional rigidity, because that is what we are looking for. We are, in effect, creating the thing we are trying to measure. Absurd, someone shouted from the crowd. Is it? Jiwan asked. The Vanthi use quantum observer manipulation in their FTL drives. You fold space by treating it as probabilistic rather than fixed. The Hive uses observer-dependent effects in their quantum computers. The Centaurians use it in their temporal sensors. You all already accept that observation affects reality in these contexts. I am just suggesting it also applies to the barrier. Ambassador Krell moved closer. His translated voice was cautious now. What exactly are you proposing? Jiwan pulled up her simulation. If we approach the barrier with instruments calibrated to measure dimensional flexibility instead of rigidity, the barrier should behave very differently. Instead of an impenetrable wall, it should act more like it is not really there. You are saying the barrier does not exist? Vex asked. No, I am saying it exists, but its properties depend on how we observe it. If we stop insisting that it must be rigid and impenetrable, it might stop being rigid and impenetrable. The chamber erupted into arguments. Some species were intrigued. Others were angry that a human would dare suggest centuries of research were based on flawed assumptions. Still others wanted to see the mathematics reviewed more carefully before making any judgments. Hyunwoo whispered to Jiwan, I think that went well. They have not thrown us out yet. That is something. High Chancellor Vex raised his appendages for silence. The chamber gradually quieted. Attaché Kim, your proposal is unconventional. It challenges fundamental assumptions that have guided our research for a very long time. However, your mathematics appear to be internally consistent. I propose that we submit your equations for thorough peer review by our scientific committees. If they find the work sound, we will consider experimental testing. That is all I ask, Chancellor. However, Vex continued, I must warn you, if your theory is wrong, if experimental tests show that the barrier behaves exactly as the Krell-Vex equations predict, you will have wasted considerable council resources and time. Your diplomatic career may not recover from that embarrassment. Jiwan nodded. I understand. I am willing to take that risk. Very well. The council will review your work. You will be notified of our decision. Jiwan and Hyunwoo were escorted out of the chamber. Once the doors closed behind them, Hyunwoo let out a breath he had been holding. That was terrifying. Could have been worse, Jiwan said. At least they are reviewing the math instead of just dismissing it. What do you think will happen? Honestly, I think most of them hope I am wrong. Because if I am right, it means they have been approaching this problem incorrectly for centuries. That is a hard thing to admit. They walked back to their office in silence. Jiwan was exhausted. She had barely slept in the 3 weeks preparing for this presentation, and the stress of presenting to 14,000 alien species had drained what energy she had left. But she also felt oddly calm. She had done what she could. The mathematics were solid. The theory was sound. Now it was up to others to decide whether to take it seriously. The review process took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of waiting while the galaxy's greatest scientific minds examined every aspect of her work. Some committees approved it quickly. Others spent weeks looking for flaws. Jiwan spent the time drinking coffee and catching up on sleep. Finally, the results came back. The mathematics were sound. The theory was consistent with known physics. It did not prove that the barrier was observer-dependent, but it showed that observer dependency was at least possible. The council voted to authorize an experimental test. They would build a probe using instruments calibrated according to G1 specifications and send it to the barrier. If it passed through, her theory was correct. If it failed, well, at least they would know. Jiwan received the news while sitting in her office drinking her morning coffee. Hyunwoo looked at her.
How do you feel?
Nervous. What if I am wrong? Then you are wrong. But at least we tried, Jiwan smiled. At least we tried. The probe was built by the galaxy's finest engineers. It incorporated technology from a dozen different species, and at its heart were the instruments that Jiwan had designed, calibrated to measure dimensional flexibility instead of rigidity. The launch was scheduled for 3 months later. 3 months of waiting to see if she had solved an ancient mystery or just made a very public fool of herself. She was going to need a lot more coffee. The probe sat in the construction bay, a beautiful piece of engineering that represented the combined knowledge of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. It was small, no larger than a human shuttle, but every centimeter was packed with sophisticated technology. Jiwan stood in the observation gallery watching the final checks. Engineers from a dozen species moved around the probe, running diagnostics and calibrations. This was the most expensive test probe ever built, and everyone wanted to make sure it worked perfectly. Hyunwoo stood beside her, reading from his datapad. The official launch is in 48 hours. They are inviting representatives from all council species to observe. No pressure then, Jiwan said. The betting pools have you at 70-30 odds. 70% chance I am wrong? 70% chance you are right, actually. A lot of scientists reviewed your work and found it convincing. Jiwan was surprised. Really, I thought most of them would be skeptical. Many are, but many others are excited. Apparently, several research groups have had similar ideas over the years but never pursued them because they seemed too radical. Your work gave them confidence that the approach might actually be valid. Or we are all wrong together. That is also possible. The days before the launch were strange. Jiwan received messages from scientists across the galaxy. Some offered support and encouragement. Others sent detailed questions about her mathematics. A few sent angry letters accusing her of arrogance for challenging established theory. She answered the questions and ignored the angry letters. Ambassador Krell visited her office 2 days before the launch. The Vonthi representative had been one of her strongest critics during the initial presentation, but his attitude seemed different now. Attaché Kim, I wanted to speak with you before the test. Of course, Ambassador. Krell's crystalline body shifted colors as he spoke. I have reviewed your work extensively. I was skeptical at first. The Krell-Vex equations are named partly after my ancestor, so I had personal reasons to defend them. I understand. But your mathematics are sound. You have not disproven the Krell-Vex equations. You have expanded them. That is very different. I tried to make that clear in my presentation. I know. I apologize for my initial hostility. You have done something remarkable. Whether the test succeeds or fails, you have given us a new way of thinking about an old problem. That alone is valuable. After Krell left, Jiwan sat quietly for a moment. She had expected opposition, not apologies. That was unexpected, Hyunwoo said. Very. Are you ready for tomorrow? No, but I do not think I will ever be ready, so we might as well do it anyway. The launch day arrived. Ji-won and Hyunwoo were not invited to the main observation center, where the senior council members would watch. That was reserved for important species and established scientists. Instead, they watched from their small office like they had watched countless other council proceedings. It felt appropriate somehow. The probe launched exactly on schedule. It would take 3 hours to reach the barrier. 3 hours of waiting to see if Ji-won's theory was right, or if she had just wasted enormous amounts of council resources on an idea that did not work. Ji-won tried to work on other things while they waited, but she could not focus. She drank coffee and paced around the office. Hyunwoo gave up on working entirely and just watched the countdown timer. 2 hours passed, then 2.5. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, Hyunwoo's datapad chimed with an incoming transmission. He looked at it and went pale. What is it? Ji-won asked. The probe is approaching the barrier. They are starting the final instrument activation sequence. Ji-won sat down. Her heart was beating too fast. On their display screen, they could see the data feed from the probe. Thousands of instruments were taking measurements, recording everything about the barrier's structure and properties. The probe crossed the theoretical boundary where the barrier should begin. According to 700 years of research, the probe should encounter massive resistance now. The energy readings should spike dramatically. The probe should slow down, unable to proceed further. None of that happened. The probe continued forward at constant speed. The energy readings remained normal. The instruments detected dimensional flexibility exactly as Ji-won had predicted. It is working, Hyunwoo whispered. It is actually working. The probe moved deeper into the region where the barrier should be solid and impenetrable, but it encountered no resistance. The barrier, treated as observer-dependent rather than fixed, behaved exactly as G1's equations predicted. It was like the barrier was not even there. At 3 hours and 7 minutes, the probe passed completely through what should have been an impenetrable wall. It emerged on the other side and began transmitting data from a region of space that no one had ever reached before. G1 sat frozen, staring at the screen. She had believed her theory was right. The mathematics were solid, but believing something and seeing it actually work were very different things. You did it, Hyunwoo said. You actually did it. We did it, G1 corrected. You helped. I checked your math and brought you coffee. You solved a 700-year-old problem. G1's data pad exploded with incoming messages. Scientists were sending congratulations and requests for more information. Council members wanted to schedule meetings. News organizations wanted interviews. She ignored all of it for the moment and just watched the data streaming in from beyond the barrier. The probe was sending back information about stars and planets that had been isolated since the universe was young. New worlds, new possibilities, all accessible because someone asked a different question. There was a knock on their office door. Ji-won opened it to find High Chancellor Vex standing outside. She nearly dropped her datapad in surprise. Chancellor, I did not expect. Please come in. Vex entered their small office. He looked around at the cramped space with what might have been amusement. This is where you worked? Where you developed the theory that solved the threshold problem? Yes, it is not much, but it has good coffee. Vex's bioluminescent patches pulsed in a pattern Ji-won had learned meant humor. Coffee. Yes, I have heard you mention coffee several times now. It helps me think. Apparently very well. Vex became more serious. Attaché Kim, the council has asked me to extend their official congratulations. And their apologies. Apologies? For dismissing humanity as too young and inexperienced to contribute meaningfully to galactic research. You have proven that assumption wrong quite dramatically. I just asked a question that others had not thought to ask. That is often how progress happens. The greatest breakthroughs come not from knowing more, but from thinking differently. Vex paused. The council would like to offer you a position as Chief Scientific Liaison. You would have a seat at the council table and significant influence over research priorities. Ji-won was shocked. That is an incredible honor. You have earned it. Will you accept? Can I keep this office? I like being close to the coffee machine. Vex's patches pulsed with definite amusement now. I believe that can be arranged. After Vex left, Ji-won and Hyunwoo sat in silence for a moment. Chief Scientific Liaison, Hyunwoo said. That is a real position of power. You will actually be able to influence galactic policy. I know. It is terrifying. What will you do with that power? Ji-won looked at the data still streaming in from the probe. New worlds, new possibilities, all accessible now because someone had questioned old assumptions. I think I will look for other old problems that everyone thinks are impossible. Problems where people have been trying the same approach for centuries without success. Maybe there are other questions we have been asking wrong. That sounds like a lot of work? It does. You are going to need a lot more coffee. Ji-won smiled. I really am. Over the next few weeks, the results of the probe test were analyzed and confirmed. Ji-won's theory was correct. The barrier was observer-dependent. By changing how they observed it, they had changed its properties. Within a month, the first manned expeditions were being planned. Ships would cross the barrier and explore regions that had been isolated for billions of years. They would find new civilizations, new resources, new knowledge. The galaxy had suddenly doubled in size, and it had all started with a human drinking coffee in a boring council meeting, wondering if everyone was asking the wrong question. The Grand Council chamber looked different when you were sitting at the actual council table instead of watching from the observation deck. Ji-won sat in a new chair, one marked with Earth's symbol, positioned among the senior members who actually made decisions. It had been a month since the probe successfully crossed the barrier. A month of chaos as the galaxy adjusted to the fact that half of the known universe was suddenly accessible. A month of planning expeditions and reorganizing trade routes and renegotiating treaties. And through it all, everyone kept asking Ji-won how she had figured it out. She gave the same answer every time. She had looked at the problem differently because she had no reason not to. Today's council session was supposed to be a formal recognition ceremony. They were going to honor all the scientists who had worked on the threshold problem over the centuries, and then they would officially thank Jiwan for solving it. But first, they had to finish arguing about who got to lead the first expedition through the barrier. The Vanthi have the most experience with dimensional physics, Ambassador Krell was saying. We should lead the initial survey missions. The Hive has superior computational resources for analyzing new data, the insectoid representative countered. Our ships should go first. High Chancellor Vex dimmed his patches. Perhaps we should allow the species who solved the problem to lead the first expedition. It seems appropriate. Everyone turned to look at Jiwan. She shook her head. Earth does not have the technology or experience for leading an expedition like this. We have been in space for barely a century. Let the species who know what they are doing take the lead. A wise answer, Vex said. I propose a joint expedition. Vanthi ships with Hive computational support and scientific teams from multiple species, including humans, if Earth is willing to contribute. That satisfied everyone. The council voted to approve the joint expedition and moved on to the ceremony. They unveiled a memorial first, a beautiful sculpture that honored all the researchers who had worked on the threshold problem throughout history. Thousands of names were listed, representing dozens of species and centuries of dedicated work. Jiwan stood before the memorial during her speech and made sure to emphasize this point. I did not solve this problem alone, she said. I built on 700 years of research by brilliant scientists from across the galaxy. Without their work, without their detailed understanding of the barrier's properties, I would have had nothing to build from. They deserve the real credit. I just added the last piece to a puzzle that thousands of people spent their lives working on. It was a good speech, humble and respectful, but everyone knew the truth. Without her insight, the puzzle might never have been completed. After the ceremony, Jiwan returned to her office. It was the same small space near the coffee machine. High Chancellor Vex had been true to his word about letting her keep it, even though chief scientific liaisons usually had much larger offices in the important sections of the station. Hyunwoo was already there, surrounded by data pads and reports. Congratulations on the ceremony, he said. You gave a good speech. Thanks. I tried not to sound arrogant. You succeeded. Very diplomatic. Jiwan sat down at her desk and looked at her own stack of reports. Being chief scientific liaison meant reviewing research proposals from across the galaxy. Everyone wanted council funding for their projects now, and she had to help decide which ones were worth supporting. It was a lot of responsibility. Sometimes she missed the days when she just sat in the observation deck drinking coffee and watching aliens argue. You have been very quiet the last few days, Hyunwoo observed. Is everything okay? Jiwan nodded. Just thinking. This whole experience has been strange. A month ago, I was nobody, just another junior diplomat from a species no one took seriously. Now I have actual power in the council. People listen when I talk. It is weird. You earned it. Did I? I asked one question and got lucky that I was right. Does that really qualify me to help make decisions for the entire galaxy? Hyunwoo put down his data pad. You are having doubts. Not about the science was right, but about whether I belong in this position. There are species who have been studying these things for thousands of years. What do I really know compared to them? You know how to ask different questions. That is apparently very rare and very valuable. Maybe. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jiwon's data pad chimed with a new message. She looked at it and smiled. What is it? Hyunwoo asked. An invitation. The first expedition through the barrier launches next week. They want me to come along as an observer. Are you going to go? I want to, but I am not sure I should. I have responsibilities here now. Jiwan, you just solved a 700-year-old problem. If you want to see the results firsthand, take a few weeks off. The council will survive without you. She thought about it. He was right. She had spent a month buried in paperwork and meetings. Maybe she needed to remember why she had gotten into this in the first place. Okay, I will go. The expedition launched 1 week later, 5 ships representing multiple species, all equipped with the new instruments that treated the barrier as observer-dependent rather than fixed. Jiwan was on the lead Vanthi vessel, along with Ambassador Krell and a scientific team that included some of the galaxy's best researchers. Crossing the barrier was anticlimactic. The ship simply flew through the region where an impenetrable wall should have been, and emerged on the other side. No resistance, no drama, just smooth passage into previously unreachable space. But what they found on the other side was anything but anticlimactic. Entire star systems that had never been explored. Planets that showed signs of ancient civilizations. Signals that suggested other spacefaring species might exist in the isolated regions, cut off from the rest of the galaxy for eons. They were not alone. The expedition spent 2 weeks conducting initial surveys. They mapped star systems, analyzed planetary compositions, and tried to decode the signals they detected. It was overwhelming. They had opened a door to an entire new section of the galaxy, and no one knew what they would find. One evening, Jiwan stood in the observation deck of the Vanthi ship, looking out at stars that no one from her side of the barrier had ever seen before. Ambassador Krell joined her. "Beautiful, is it not?" the Vanthi said. "It is. Hard to believe. All of this was here the whole time, just cut off by mathematics. Not just mathematics. By our assumptions about mathematics, that is what you taught us. I just asked a question. Yes, a question that no one else thought to ask." Krell's crystalline body shifted colors. "I have been thinking about that. About why we did not ask that question. We had all the pieces. Many scientists had noticed that the Krell-Vex equations did not account for observer effects. But we dismissed it as irrelevant. Why? Pride, perhaps. The equations were named after the 2 greatest scientists in galactic history. Questioning them felt like disrespect, and we had invested centuries of work based on those equations. Admitting they were incomplete would mean admitting all that work needed to be revised. So everyone just kept using them even though they might be wrong. Not wrong, but incomplete, as you said. There is a difference. Jiwan sipped her coffee. She had brought her own supply on the expedition because the Vanthi did not drink stimulants and did not understand why humans needed them. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we explore. We catalog what we find. We try to make contact with whatever civilizations might exist on this side of the barrier. It will take decades, maybe centuries. And Earth will be part of that. Of course, humanity has earned its place in galactic society. No one will dismiss your species as too young or inexperienced anymore." After the expedition returned, Jiwan threw herself back into her work as chief scientific liaison. She reviewed proposals, attended meetings, and helped guide council research priorities. But she also made a point of looking for other old problems that had stumped the council for generations. There were many of them. The galaxy was full of unanswered questions and unsolved mysteries. Most had been studied extensively by brilliant scientists who all approached them the same way. Jiwan wondered how many of those problems just needed someone to ask a different question. She started keeping a list. Problems where the council had spent centuries making no progress. Questions where everyone agreed on the assumptions, but no one had thought to question those assumptions. It was going to be a long list. One day, High Chancellor Vex visited her office again. He looked at her cramped workspace with the coffee machine in the corner and shook his head in amusement. "You still have not moved to a larger office." "I like it here. Good coffee, good window view." "Coffee? You keep mentioning coffee." "I have been meaning to ask." "What exactly is coffee?" Jiwan laughed and poured him a cup. "It is a stimulant drink. Humans use it to stay alert and focused." Vex accepted the cup cautiously and took a small sip. His bioluminescent patches flickered rapidly. "This is terrible. It is an acquired taste." "And you solved the threshold problem while drinking this?" "Several cups of this, yes." Vex set down the cup carefully. Perhaps the council should invest in better coffee facilities. If one human with terrible beverages can solve a centuries-old problem, imagine what humanity might accomplish with good coffee. Now you are thinking like a human. Is that a good thing? Sometimes. When everyone else is thinking the same way and getting nowhere, it helps to have someone who thinks differently. Vex's patches pulsed in agreement. I suppose you are right. That is why we made you Chief Scientific Liaison, to bring that different perspective to council research. After Vex left, Jiwon returned to her work. She had dozens of proposals to review, 3 meetings scheduled for the afternoon, and a report due on potential research directions for exploring beyond the barrier. But she also had her list of impossible problems, questions that everyone had given up on because the smart species had tried everything they could think of and failed. Maybe those problems just needed someone who did not know they were supposed to be impossible. Someone who would ask stupid questions and suggest ridiculous ideas and not care that everyone thought they were wrong. Someone who drank too much coffee and wondered why everyone kept trying the same approaches that never worked. Jiwon smiled and pulled up the first problem on her list. It was time to start asking different questions again. The galaxy was a big place and humans were very good at asking questions.